Hello, everybody. Welcome. As people start to come in, we are just going to wait like a minute or two, but we want to welcome you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. People are flowing in. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for your lunch hour. It's at the top of the hour. It's noon. I hope everyone's having a good lunch. We're halfway through the day, almost halfway through the week. Not quite there yet, but almost. We're getting there. And we have a long weekend coming up. We have a Memorial Day weekend, so we really have something to look forward to. So just hold on a few more days. Hi, Allie. Allie said hello. Helped us out so much with this panel. We really appreciate all the help and the behind the scenes work that went into making this panel. It's going to be a great discussion. Folks are streaming in. Hope that everyone is having a good day. We're going to wait just one more minute. I see the numbers rising here. People are streaming in. Slowly but surely.
We got to grab those sandwiches first.
Exactly. Sandwiches, your hot cup of tea or coffee. It's midday. And I hope everyone's having a great day, a great week. We are having some great weather finally in New York City. I'm not sure where everyone else is, but consistently it seems like it's spring. So I'm looking forward to that as well as summer. Yay.
Yep.
Okay, so it's 12:02. People will stream in as they come. I'm going to get started because we have so much to get to. Welcome, everyone. I think, who's starting off with the introductions?
Yeah.
Gloria? I'm going to turn it over to Gloria, but thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Yep. Thank you, Radia, for welcoming everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I guess it's 3 minutes past 12, so it is the afternoon. On behalf of Asian Americans in media, thank you for taking the time to attend today's virtual event honoring AAPI Heritage Month. My name is Gloria Lee. I am the founding president of Asian Americans in Media, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization launched in the spring of 2018, whose mission is threefold: to build and empower our communities, advance and promote our leaders, and champion our stories and perspectives. Before we begin today's session, I'd like to take a moment to thank our esteemed panelists, Nydia Han, Bill Amada, John Yang, and Tamlin Tamita for contributing their time and brilliant minds to discuss this important conversation of the role of media in anti-Asian racism and hate crimes. I also want to make sure to acknowledge and thank the AIM team, led by Mika Bondi, which includes Ali Angvarapong, Salim Malkana, and Iris Lee, who spent countless hours behind the scenes to make sure today happens. A heartfelt thank you also to media industry titan Susan Jin Davis for the critical role you played in orchestrating today's events. And last but not least, a sincere thank you to NAMIC New York and WIC New York for your allyship and co-sponsorship of today's event. While these are very trying times for the AAPI community, the silver lining of this time is building these allyship relationships. So thank you. And without further ado, I'll pass back over to Radia, so you can welcome on behalf of NAMIC, but thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Radia Barnes, and I'm the president of the New York chapter of the National Association for Multi-Ethnicity and Communications. I'm honored to partner with Asian Americans in Media today, as well as the New York chapter of Women in Cable and Telecommunications. Racial unity, equity, and inclusion can only be accomplished with discussions such as this. So I want to thank everyone for joining us and having this great and impactful discussion. I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Tisdale, the president of WIC New York.
Thanks so much, Radia. I am, as Radia said, the president of the local chapter of WIC here in New York. We work to empower women and help them be successful in their careers. While I'm not at all excited about the reason an event like this is needed, I'm very much looking forward to hearing from this panel. The teams from AIM, NAMIC, and WIC New York have worked very hard behind the scenes to pull this amazing panel together for you. So I will not delay it any further, and I'll pass it back to Gloria Lee to give you a few logistics and get us started.
Yep. Thank you, Radia and Lisa. In addition to working formally on this, they're also very, very good friends. So excited to work with you on this event. But as Lisa mentioned, I wanted to highlight a few logistics items. Please note that during the panel, you'll be able to enter your questions in the chat box. We'll keep track of those questions and look to answer them towards the end. We're going to have a discussion after the panel, which will be moderated by Susan Jin Davis. And with that, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Emmy Award-winning TV journalist and TEDx speaker Nydia Han, in addition to co-anchoring 6 ABC Action News Sundays and being the station's consumer investigative reporter and being the recipient of countless media industry awards. Nydia is the creator of #ThisIsAmerica, a provocative 3-part documentary series about racism and the diverse American experience. We are flattered that you have taken the time out of your busy schedule to moderate our event, Nydia. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, and good afternoon, everybody, or good morning if you're on the West Coast. Thank you so much to AIM, NAMIC New York, and WIC New York for creating this space to have this important conversation. And while we are gathering to talk about anti-Asian hate today, this is ultimately not just about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. This is about creating a world where everyone is safe and feels secure and knows that they belong. So on this day that marks 1 year since the murder of George Floyd, I also want to acknowledge the ongoing pain and struggles and challenges of the Black community and let everyone out there know that we stand in solidarity with you as well. We have a lot of ground to cover today. For those of you who are not fully aware of the current pandemic-related anti-Asian hate, we're going to bring you up to speed. And we really want to shine a light on the fact that this rise in hate that we are seeing today did not suddenly erupt. It is nothing new. In fact, I wrote in an op-ed piece back in February, and then earlier this month, once again, that many Asian Americans saw this coming because it is deeply rooted in a long and painful history of racism and stereotyping that's impacted AAPIs for centuries. And finally, we want to talk about solutions and allyship and how we can really change the narrative of AAPIs long term. We want to talk about things that are truly deep and impactful. And we also want to address how people outside of the AAPI community can support us. And we have a terrific panel to tackle all of these topics. John Yang is the president and executive director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice. He leads the organization's efforts to fight for civil rights and empower Asian Americans through public policy advocacy, education, and litigation. Tamla Tamita, I'm sure, is a name and face you all know. She made her screen debut in The Karate Kid Part 2 and has since appeared in numerous films, TV, and theater projects, including The Joy Luck Club and Picture Bride. Bill Amata is Chairman and Chief Connectivity Officer of IW Group, a fully integrated marketing communications agency specializing in growing multicultural markets. Bill is also co-founding member of several Asian American and Pacific Islander organizations. I could go on and on about our 3 panelists today. They have used their voices to empower and uplift our communities and relentlessly advocated for AAPIs throughout their careers. So I'm so honored to be moderating this particular panel with these folks today. So let's begin by talking about the current situation. The National Coalition Stop AAPI Hate just released new data a couple weeks ago. It shows a whopping 6,603 anti-Asian hate incidents were reported during the pandemic. And we know the number is actually far higher. This is not the entire picture because we know that these crimes and these incidents are generally underreported. I myself have covered unprovoked attack after attack. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are being spit on, slapped, slugged, set on fire, and in some cases even killed. And while these brutal attacks have shined a light on anti-Asian hate, anyone who walks in our shoes knows all too well that this hate also manifests every day in the form of subtle or casual racism or so-called jokes. So John Yang, I'd like to begin with you. This anti-Asian hate is nothing new. So can you provide some background and some history of anti-Asian racism and how it has led to discriminatory policy in America?
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be with all of you on this panel. Oh, it's always a delight to work with all of you. I know all of us have worked together on various projects in the past. So we're talking about racism as it relates to the Asian American community. One myth that has to be dismantled that really is at the core of this racism is this perpetual foreigner myth. This notion that regardless of how long Asian Americans have been in the United States, even if we were born here, we're seen as a foreigner or we're seen as an other. And therefore, oftentimes we're seen as a threat. So that's in some ways the through line to this racism, both that we're seeing now, as well as the racism that we've seen historically. Now, part of the reason why we're seeing it is because of COVID-19. Because of COVID-19, we have fears, understandable fears, whether it's health-related fears or economic fears. When you have these fears, it is natural for people to have a tendency to want to blame something or someone. Unfortunately, that target has been the Asian American community. And part of that has been normalized by the prior administration, where you had a president that used terms such as Chinese virus, Wuhan flu, even worse derivations of that, even though all of the guidance said that that would have a stigmatizing effect on the Asian American community. Now, we should also be clear, some of the precursors existed even before COVID-19. We have real geopolitical tensions with the Chinese government, whether it is their dismantling of democracy in Hong Kong, whether it's their oppression of the Uyghur minority, the Muslim minority in Xinjiang province. There are legitimate reasons that we need to criticize that government policy. But too often, when we criticize government policy, there is that other aspect, this backlash against our Asian American community back home. Why do I say that? Let's go back in history. If we go back to the late 1800s, when we had Chinese railroad workers that were doing some of the most dangerous work, dynamiting through the mountains to get to Promontory Point, the so-called Golden Spike in Utah, we had Chinese that were being lynched in California, driven out of Colorado, driven out of Seattle. Why? Because of the so-called yellow peril, this notion that they were bringing disease to the country. Then you fast forward 60 years from that, when we have World War II. Again, legitimate foreign threat, but what happened was the backlash against the Asian American community. Specifically, 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent were put in incarceration camps based on falsified evidence of so-called potential loyalties to the Empire of Japan. Then you fast forward another 60 years to 9/11. Again, we had a terrorist attack on our soil, but what we saw was this tremendous backlash against the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian American community that resulted in murders, a lot of physical violence against that community. Again, because of that fear of terrorism. So anytime we have fear, we see that backlash against our Asian American community. And so we need to educate ourselves about that, make sure we make that distinction between some of these issues that we're seeing abroad, and make sure that we have the proper nuance so that we don't bring that to our shores and think of all Asian Americans as foreigners, think of all Asian Americans as somehow threats to American society.
Fear really is the driver of discrimination and division, and the coronavirus is just the latest vehicle. John, you're absolutely right. Thank you so much for that. Tamlin, you narrated the wonderful PBS documentary, Asian Americans, which highlights our history as well as who we are. This is information that is generally non-existent in the classroom. So what did you learn in the making of that program, and what are just a couple things you really want people to know, especially now?
I think to echo back what John's words were saying, and in discussing about fear and the power of fear, because it's the simple fact that we don't know. We don't know the stories of so many generations of Asians coming to America and have planted themselves, their families, and their communities here in America. Beginning with, I believe, the Indian American family. Those are stories that we seem to gloss over, because how pertinent is that as East Asians or South Asians or Southeast Asians? We are all under a bigger umbrella this year, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And so we have this responsibility, but also the innate curiosity about knowing who we are, who we neighbor, who we link arms with under this umbrella. And in having the honor of narrating the documentary, which is still streaming, I believe, on PBS throughout the month of May for free. So please go ahead and watch it. It's 5 hours of stories that every American should know, especially those of Asian descent. But I stress the fact that every American should know these stories because it is woven in the American myth. It is woven into the American promise. It is woven into the American fabric and society that we are all literally brothers and sisters in. We unite ourselves under the flag, and to see these kinds of faces saying, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America is sometimes not seen as normal. But when we see persons talking about our stories, about stories that we should know, is the importance of seeing documentaries, seeing films, seeing theater, seeing television stories, and especially news reports like you, Nydia, in telling the stories of what goes on day to day throughout generations, throughout eras, and throughout the entire history of this country. So it is about the excavating and the uplifting and the spotlighting of the stories that attest to the importance of being able to interpret and to translate and to transmit the depth and the meaning of who we are as an American people.
I am so grateful that you are amplifying our stories, Tamlin. And in fact, you were a junior in high school when you learned about Japanese American internment, right?
Right. Thank you so much. Because we were all under this wonderful American schooling system, and you read that one paragraph, 120,000 Japanese Americans were interned on the West Coast. You run home, I run home and go, Dad, did this happen to you? Yeah. And I think that is a story that recurs not only with Japanese Americans, but with Chinese Americans. Did our grandparents or our great grandparents work on the railroad? For Korean Americans, it's like, which immigration wave did you come in? For Vietnamese, we could go down the list of what it means to be under this wonderful, huge umbrella of AAPI. And it's like, how are we connected? How do we get here? When did our families choose to become America and be a part of this country? And that's who we all are as Americans who are able to claim our ethnic heritages.
Yeah, there's so much beauty in our diversity, but so many common threads as well. Tamlin, thank you. Bill, John talked about the forever foreigner or perpetual foreigner syndrome and stereotype. Can you talk about the model minority myth? What is it and why is it so harmful?
Well, the model minority myth, Nydia, was imposed on us, several decades ago. And this notion of model minority makes us invisible. And Vishaka Desai, who's a visiting scholar over at Columbia, who was also president of Asia Society, said, whenever somebody labels us a model minority, that just provides this view of Asian Americans as having made it in America, having lived the American dream, a very problem-free community. And that's further from the truth. And so one of the things that that myth creates for us is it makes us completely invisible in America. And that's what's so dangerous. What it also hides is the fact that Asians, just as an example, passed Black Americans several years ago as having the biggest income gap of any ethnic community, any racial group in America. And that hides those things. But the other thing that I think is very important, what John just was talking about, this perpetual foreigner, is part of the reason why this exists is because we don't not only tell our stories, which Tamlin just said, but we also need to have our allies talk about Asian Americans. So I have to say, whenever I hear BIPOC, I cringe. And this isn't to not say we're not allies with Black and Indigenous people. We are, and we stand shoulder to shoulder with them on their journeys and the racism that they have faced. But we need to get our allies to say Asian American. And so whenever I hear BIPOC, I say, please include us, because what happens to us over and over again in these discussions is that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are typically put in that other category. And so in order for us to eliminate this perpetual minority myth and this model minority myth, we need to have our allies say, Asian Americans also have suffered, as you have very clearly mentioned earlier in this discussion, as John has mentioned and as Tamlin mentioned, that we have faced discrimination, we have faced hardship, we have been abused and murdered and harassed through the centuries, just as other communities have had. So the danger of this model minority myth is that it places us in this awkward position of being invisible. And I think part of it also stems from the fact that we have this image of being hard workers. We have this image of being humble and quiet. We have this image of being people that don't like to rock the boat. And this also perpetuates this myth that, you know, we're content, we're happy, we do our work and we don't bother anybody. So it's very dangerous for us as a community to have that myth over our
It really does. It fails to acknowledge the struggles and the challenges that we as AAPIs face. It also pits us against other communities of color. You've talked a lot about the importance of Black Asian Solidarity Bill. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, so first of all, on the anniversary of George Floyd, like you said, we stand shoulder to shoulder against racism wherever it is. Racism is racism, regardless of who perpetuates it against any of our communities. So without pitting us against any of the communities, which I think is inherent in what we look at in terms of white supremacy, they set those narratives for us. And we have to change those narratives by leaning in and not only telling our stories like Tamlin said, but also lean in and tell the stories of Black Americans, of Latinx Americans, of LGBT communities, of all the communities, the indigenous communities, of all the communities that have faced discrimination, hatred, as they try to grow and develop in our country. So one of the things that I think we as a community need to do, once we coalesce, and I'm seeing this coalesce, seeing our community coalesce now because of the anti-Asian hate. But once we coalesce as a community, we also have to make sure that we help lift all other communities through this pandemic and through what's happening all around the country in terms of hatred and discrimination and racism.
Yeah, we have to show up for other communities. We also have to show up for ourselves. I think for so long, we would all put our heads down and ignore racist incidents and comments. And I think the time has come for us to seize this opportunity to say enough is enough, and this is not okay for us, and it's not okay for anybody else. John, President Biden recently signed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. What does it aim to do? What do you think about it? And what other policies for change would you like to see?
Yeah, and this goes to Bill's point, is that we need a better understanding of our community. Our community can't be invisible because oftentimes our community is left out of that data. So the main thing here with this new Hate Crimes Act is to allow for better data with respect to hate incidents that are happening throughout our country. It's not focused just on the Asian American community. It's focused on all vulnerable communities. And when I say all, that includes gender, that includes sexual orientation, includes religion, as well as race and ethnicity. It also includes disability. The reality is for all of these vulnerable communities, their stories don't get told, the data doesn't get collected. So what this does is allow for collection of data. Specific for our Asian American community, it also ensures that we have language access. Why our community doesn't report hate crimes, hate incidents, in part is because of the lack of language access. A third of our community is limited English proficient. In other words, we don't speak English fluently, we're more comfortable in a different language. And so if we're providing resources of any sort, we need to ensure that we're providing them in language for those that want to do that. Does it go far enough? Certainly not. Even the administration would not say that this goes far enough. But it's a good start. I mean, you're not going to be able to legislate away racism. But what we need to recognize is we need to recognize some of the issues that are affecting our communities. And frankly, there's a certain symbolism to passing legislation in this time to make sure that people see that our community has suffered, our community is in pain, and there's things that are being done about it. One last thing I would want to add on to what Bill is saying about showing solidarity. One thing that I want to be very, very clear on when we're talking about hate crimes, hate incidents, all of our communities are being affected. It's not lost on me that at the same time we're seeing an increase in hate crimes and hate incidents against the Asian American community, that we saw the murder of George Floyd, that we saw the murder of Daunte Wright, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. And it's that racism that we need to fight together. And we have to be careful about those that are trying to divide us. One of the most recent things that I've been seeing is people that are suggesting that African Americans are the groups that are attacking the Asian American community. And this typically is in the form of some viral video that is circulated. The reality is, the statistics are that that is not the case. A study that was done by the NIH that came out in January of this year showed that over 75% of the attackers were white people. In another study that came out just in the last week from the University of Michigan, same thing, over 75% were Caucasians. Only 10% were African Americans. So if we're going to show solidarity, we also need to make sure we dispel that misinformation, that disinformation that is out there, and make sure that we do not have these moments where people try to divide us and make us fight against each other, against fighting that versus fighting that systemic racism that all of us should be addressing.
That's exactly right. I always say we have to stand not just shoulder to shoulder, but on each other's shoulders so that together we can see over that wall of racism that's impacting all of us. That is just so important. There are so many different ways that we can amplify our stories, we can move in, we can create change. One of those spheres, as we were just talking about, is politics. I know the AAJC is working to increase the Asian American community's political power. Talk about the work that you're doing in that space.
Sure. And when we talk about political power, let's be clear, it's political with a small p. In some ways, we're talking about civic engagement. We're talking about the power of voting. The reality is voting should not be seen as something that is divided by political party. The reality is that if you are a citizen, you should have the means to vote with whatever means are most comfortable for you and maximize that accessibility to the polls. And then we fight about ideas, if you will, and let us have those fights about policies and the like. And so certainly for our organization, part of it is both working within Congress as well working through litigation, through lawsuits to ensure that Asian Americans have that right to vote. We don't face barriers such as voter identification. We don't face barriers such as limitations on mail-in ballots. Asian Americans have the strongest preference for mail-in ballots. A recent survey that was done said that 64% of Asian Americans prefer to vote by mail. Both in Arizona, Georgia, and Florida, Asian Americans outperformed, so to speak, with respect to voting by mail versus the different other ways of voting compared to other populations. So that's just one example of how, when we're thinking about the franchise of voting, we're thinking about how to make sure that Asian Americans are politically empowered. We have to think about those policies that are limiting our abilities. And again, find ways to make sure that those policies are dismantled, those policies are deconstructed so that we do have access and equity in this process.
Yeah, it's so important and such an important piece of the overall solution here. Tamli, you're so selective in the work that you do. Talk about the concerns that you've had about how Asian Americans have been portrayed historically in Hollywood and by the media, and what you're doing to really change that narrative.
Well, thank you. And again, it's all circular, the cyclical nature of all the histories and the timelines that both Bill and John have been talking about affect the world of storytelling, of movie making, of Hollywood or theater, where I come from. And it is about, it all relates to that otherness, that perpetual foreigner, the evil, the unknown, the to be feared, versus the model minority, the good, the angelic, the perfect son, the perfect daughter who grows up to be the doctor or daughter. Those are the two bookends that Asian American Pacific Islanders seem to be delegated. That's why we're kind of invisibilized. We're only the bookends. We're either good or evil. What's really missing is the human aspect, the humanity, the human beings that really, in reality, are within those two parameters. This is the kind of focus that I need to do as a storyteller in terms of seeing the fallibilities, the vulnerabilities, but also the triumphs and the heroism of persons who have faces that reflect our heritages. And it's, again, it's not just Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, but to also promote those stories of African Americans, of LGBTQs, of our Latino, Latina communities, indigenous communities that seem to be forgotten by the wayside most of the time. That's why in celebrating President Biden's announcement that this is AANH, Native Hawaiian, it recognizes the indigenous people of our 50th state. So this is the kinds of thought processes that I go through. And I believe that every actor of a cultural or recognizable or ethnic background has to wrestle with her or himself, because we are seen as role models. We're thrust up there in a movie screen when we go back to the movie theaters, 60 feet wide, or on televisions in perpetuity. We know that seeing these faces, telling those stories, inhabiting those characters, a lot of the time are the introduction to persons who don't have access to people who look like us. They may know the person who runs the Chinese restaurant, the Chinese restaurant that are ubiquitous through America. This is the #1 cuisine, I believe, through another documentary that people are fans of. We may go to a little Tokyo or a Japantown on the San Francisco coast. We may go to the Vietnamese communities down in Houston. We may go to Koreatown in New Jersey, where Andy Kim is congressman. These are the kinds of the stories that I inhabit on film, television, theater, that I have to represent the persons that are not seen usually between those two goalposts of model minority and perpetual foreigner. So I choose to be selective. I ask that all our storytellers or our audience members go seek out those stories that go, oh, I didn't know this, or I want to know more. So this is the reason why I guess the whole world of storytelling is so important.
And it's so important. And it's so important that we have people like you, Tamlin, on the screen. You know, I was so disturbed the other day when I read that recent study showing that when asked about prominent Asian Americans, 42% of respondents said they couldn't think of one.
Couldn't think of one. Yeah.
It's amazing, right? And then I think the biggest group after that was 11% named Jackie Chan, who was a Hong Kong actor, and then Bruce Lee, who died in 1973. I mean, we really have a lot of work to do.
Right, exactly.
Bill, I know that you're really concerned about the lack of AAPI leaders in the corporate world. Talk about that and potential solutions. What needs to happen here so that we have more AAPIs in positions of power?
First of all, Nydia, we need to have more people like you in these roles. And one of the things that upsets me a little bit about our community is when we get senior leaders in the highest levels of corporate America and in foundations and even in these mainstream nonprofit organizations, we don't have a support group behind them. And so we push these companies and these organizations to make sure that they reflect the diversity of all communities. But when we get Asian Americans in the highest levels of these companies, they have no one else that looks like them. And so I've been trying to get more of the nonprofit organizations and the community-based groups all around the country to ask for meetings with corporation executives. And I will tell you, I learned this from the Black community, the Latinx community, LGBT community, the Jewish community, even the communities with disabilities. They request meetings annually with the CEOs of major Fortune 500 companies, and they get them. But our community, for some reason, doesn't have the gumption, I guess, to ask for these meetings, and they should. And when we get these people in these senior-most roles, we should do whatever we can to make sure that we support them. And that means writing letters. And like a lot of nonprofit groups, they receive corporate dollars from many of these corporations. And that number of corporations that are giving to our community shrinks every single year. The only reason why I picked up this year is because of the anti-Asian bias and hate. So I want nonprofits to lean in, write letters, and ask for meetings with CEOs to talk about their diversity goals, their support for people of color, particularly Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Ask for what they're doing in terms of their corporate contributions. Ask what they're doing in terms of investing. Ask if there are other NIDIAs in the pipeline so that we have a good, strong group of people to help us when they advance in corporate America, because it helps to have somebody on the outside agitating, but it also is critical to have people on the inside pushing corporate executives to do the right thing in our communities. I worry about what John said, because John's talking about policy, but if you look at what the American Legal Foundation just popped up and came up with, they found that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are dropping out of law school in large numbers. And that's worrisome to me, because we don't have a pipeline now for potential judges or elected people that are going to set those policies. I worry about what Tamlin Tomita just said, because we not only need to have people that are writers and people that are producers, but in my industry, 70% of PR people are women. 30% of those people hold executive positions. But if you look at Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, we have a very small number of people to get to the C-suite of PR, marketing, and advertising. And part of it is because we don't have that support group.
The advocacy that you're talking about makes a real difference. And I know that, Bill, firsthand. The reason why I was hired in Houston at the ABC owned and operated station was because a group of Asian American community members went to the station, had a meeting with the general manager and said, we need somebody on the air who looks like us. And it was after that that they looked to really hire an Asian American Pacific Islander correspondent. And that person happened to be me. But so I'm really grateful. And I know that what you're talking about really, really makes a powerful impact. So thank you. And I hope that more people will do that, and more community members and leaders will step up and make that effort, that concerted effort, and take that initiative. John, how do you feel corporations and ERGs can help the situation?
Yeah, and just to tag on to what Bill is saying, I think they are making a difference, especially over this past year and a half. I've seen Asian American ERGs, BRGs just show up in a different way. And that's another way to cause a company to take notice, to adopt different policies. And so in this sense, I think what we're talking about is, if you will, an outside-inside game, right? Organizations like mine, I agree with Bill, we have a responsibility to talk to corporations and talk to them about what the policies are. So making sure that they have that pipeline, making sure that sort of with respect to what the outward image is consistent with what we want as an organization with respect to our values. But then what we need help with is for the people on the inside, if you will, to be reiterating those same messages. That's how we saw movement in Georgia over this past 6 months around voting. It's because both the outside groups were talking to corporations like Delta, Coca-Cola, et cetera, to talk about how important voting is to all of our communities. And then to have those employee resource groups also internally say, we enjoy working here, but part of why we believe in working here is because of the values. And we want to make sure that this company reflects our values. So there's definitely a lot of synergy that can be developed between sort of those ERGs and BRGs. And in that sense, I definitely see that as a win-win, because certainly what I want to bring to the table is to give them the resources that they need, whether it's the history, whether it's the statistics, so that they can use it to do the advocacy on their own within the companies.
I love that. And Tamlin, we are seeing a new energy and stronger AAPI activism just across the board. Can you talk about those efforts and whether you have hope that this will make a long-term difference?
I think what we're seeing and we're witnessing gladly with great joy and anticipation for all the network and cable television shows that will focus in on Asian Americans and their stories. But we're also seeing a movement in the film industry, which is totally different. Film and TV are different animals, but we're seeing a move towards recognizing the value, the weight, the beauty, the complexity of being Asian in America. I think with again, not to knock a piece of knowledge that we all know, but celebrating the efforts of Minari and the story of Lee Isaac Chung, knowing that it resonates with so many people because that's an American story. That kind of story of really literally pulling yourself by the bootstraps, planting your roots in the ground, took place in that story. It just happened to be with these kinds of faces. So we're seeing that trajectory of seeing, wow, we know these people, we know these kinds of characters. We just haven't seen these stories populated with faces like ours. So when we see television shows headed by Kumail Nanjiani, or we see the Eternals that is going to be helmed by Chloe Zhao and headed by Gemma Chan. That's the kind of movement that we're seeing. We're seeing this reboot on the CW of Kung Fu, and we're actually seeing the kind of stories that we all wished we could have seen when Bill, John, Susan, and I were kids. It's like we didn't want to see a guy with a white guy wearing yellow face makeup. This is the kinds of stories. These are the kinds of people. That's the kind of ambiance that really is relatable, not only to us, but to the whole audience, and relating that they're just like us. They just happen to be working up in San Francisco and working at a restaurant, but they have these kinships with the other communities outside Chinatown with their larger San Franciscan community. So it's that kind of energy that we're seeing, that we're not just the peasant or the refugee. There are plenty of stories of which also need to be amplified and shown as well. But they're just folks who are Brady Bunch, who could have been Brady Bunch, who could be the stories on Grey's Anatomy or the comedy shows that are blanking on the top of my head. But it's the kind of normalization, it's the kind of neutralization that we all are trying to achieve the American dream. And it sounds very Pollyannish for me, but it's about getting down to the basics. It's about seeking who our neighbors are. It's going not only to Congress and looking at who we vote for president and our senators, but it's going to the city council, it's going to the neighborhood council, it's going to the school districts and saying, how can I get involved? I have children. I have neighbors who have children, and we're all running around the streets together, just trying to make a better, safer, a cleaner, a more equitable kind of neighborhood. So it takes all of us in terms of telling these stories about who we are. And if it's just having a cup of coffee and saying, hey, how you doing, neighbor? Let's start there, because this is the legislation and the policy making is the bigger picture. But it takes the small steps. It takes the actualization of going to the school district, to your churches, to the store, to the local coffee shop and saying, hey, I've seen you around. Let's get to know each other. And it begins with those small, minuscule steps that continues into a big wave of movement forward.
It is so important that we move in, because it's hard to hate close up. And I've been saying for a long time that we really have to figure out a way to get everyone to come to the table. So like when I did that This Is America docuseries, I made sure to talk to people who have a different experience and a very different lens than I do. So for instance, there was this guy named Wayne Cheeseman who kind of fueled the fire on Facebook over this video that I posted explaining all of the ways in which I am an American and sort of taking back those words, this is America. And, he ghosted me when I asked him if he would meet with me in person and on camera. So I just showed up at his house one day, and we ended up having this really nice conversation. I spent the afternoon with his family. He has kids about the same ages as my kids. We both love basketball. We both have these crazy upside down work schedules. And when we figured out all these things that we have in common, it opened up a space for us to talk about the ways in which we're different and the different ways we see the world, and just move in a little bit so that we at least have a better understanding of each other's life experience. I think the thing that we both walked away from and thinking is that at least we have the same core values and the same dreams and hopes for our futures and for our family's future. And if we could focus on those things and figure out how we could achieve those things together, we can actually make progress. So I appreciate that. I think that's so important. I've also been really inspired by the very young activists I've met recently. So a couple of weeks ago, I interviewed a high school girl high school student who wrote a book called No One Like Me. She's Korean American, and she opens the book by talking about how no one like me felt like a negative phrase, where she wanted to have blonde hair and long legs and blue eyes. But then she went on this journey and realized that, it is her Asian-ness that is one of the most beautiful things about her. And so then no one like me becomes this positive phrase where she says, there's no one like me because I'm special and I'm unique and I love who I am. So, I also interviewed a high school playwright who wrote a play called Pandemic. And it's about sort of this rise in current anti-Asian hate, but she parallels it to a young woman who was growing up during the Chinese Exclusion Act. So there's so many people doing so many great things. I want to talk more about specific things that people outside of our community can do right now to support us and help us. Bill, can I start with you? And then John, can you answer that question too?
Bill dropped off.
Oh, okay, so John.
Sure. And I love what both Nydia, you, and Tamlin are saying about all of these little, quote unquote, little things, because I think part of this moment is not thinking that anything is too small. I'm privileged to be at an organization where I can work on policy, so to speak. But if we break it down, at a very base level, I'm going to start from where I started at the beginning of this conversation. One of the things that dogs our community is this notion of being a perpetual foreigner. So if I had a non-Asian friend, when someone asked me, where are you really from? That non-Asian friend says, he's from Chicago. He likes the Bulls, he's American. That would go such a long way because it would take the burden off of me to justify myself and justify that I'm American. So that's a small step. Maybe a step up from this goes to the fact that, you guys were all talking about having kids, right? Or sort of having school-aged children. Well, part of that is during Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, making sure that your teacher teaches an hour a day on Asian American history so that we're, again, not seen as that foreigner. It's a bite-sized chunk that's very doable. There's a number of organizations that offer, lesson plans for these types of situations, these types of classes. Then you take it another step up. If you have the willingness to do so, serve on the PTA, serve on a school board, right? Those are part-time positions. Yes, it's not for everyone because those do require time, but still it's doable, and you could see real change. You could see change for your kids or for your community. Going up from that would be city council or something along those lines. So what I'm suggesting is there's all of these different things that all of us can do that are sort of manageable, if you will, depending on what your own time constraints are, because all of us at different points in our career have either more time or less time, and that's okay. The only thing I would ask of everyone that is watching is just do something. Don't just, don't think, oh, there's nothing I can do, or I can't do that much. Because if you start to break it down, all of these quote unquote little things matter. One of the things I often talk about is the fact that, if we're trying to build a house, if we're trying to build a house of unity, it requires a lot of bricks. And that first brick that you lay down might feel like it's meaningless, might feel like I will never get there. But if each of us start to put a brick on top of a brick on top of a brick, before you know it, you will see that progress. And before you know it, you'll see a beautiful foundation that will go towards that beautiful house that all of us want to live in together.
That everyday allyship that you're talking about is so critical. I mean, I can tell you that in our newsroom, for instance, there have been times where I've pitched stories related to the Asian American Pacific Islander community. And if it's crickets, the story often doesn't get covered. But if all of my colleagues chime in and say, hey, listen, this is a story I think we need to cover, or this is a great story, let's do it at 5 p.m., then it gets covered. And so that allyship is so powerful, and there really is strength in numbers. So I appreciate that. And, also just being in a meeting sometimes, and if someone says something that doesn't quite sound right, and when someone else who is not a person in that group pipes up to say, doesn't sound right to me either, I think that makes a big difference. Bill, I see you're back with us. We're asking what people outside of our community can do, actionable steps they can take to help support AAPIs right now.
Well, one of the things that I definitely want to encourage folks in the news industry, is to encourage the community to participate in editorial board meetings. And I think that's something our community isn't very good at doing yet. There's a handful of groups that can do that. So I think it would be great if the traditional, the print and the broadcast media could reach out and just say, we'd like to hear a little bit more about the stories that John and Tamlin were talking about. Can you come into our newsroom and have a discussion with us? I think that will be immensely helpful, but also to include us in conversations. And I think somebody just mentioned this earlier. I think it was you, Nydia, that we have to expand our table. And I learned from a Latino community not too long ago, they say something like, donde comen cinco, comen seis. If you can feed 5 people at your dinner table, there's always room for a 6th or a 7th or an 8th. And I think we have to have that same attitude, all of our communities, is that when we pull together a table of people, let's not just include people, let's engage those people. Let's ask them questions, pull them into conversations, because as Tamlin said, it's about storytelling, but we need to move on from storytelling to story living and story doing, where we're actually taking actions, leaning in, asking people to talk about their stories, sharing those stories, and finding those intersections between all of our communities.
This is so important. We're going to go to Q&A in just a moment, but I want to make sure that we kind of cover everything and address everything that you guys thought was most important. So I kind of just want to do a roundtable of final thoughts, if we can. Can we start with you, Tamlin?
Again, it's just, I'm just bouncing ideas and just saying yes and hurrah in silence here. But with what Bill was saying is that it's not just storytelling, because those are the tellings of stories that we already know, where we come from, what's behind us, what our legacy is. It's story making. That's why the popularity of science fiction stories or fantasy stories are so powerful. This is why I had my personal opinion that we're so enamored of superhero stories, is because they are story makers. These are worlds that do not exist, but they're populated with persons who have abilities to change. Change what? Change for the better, for all of us. We always notice that who the evil one, because they're the ones it's about me, or I have to, be the richest person or be the most powerful person. But the true heroes are the ones who change the world for all of us for the better. So I see that kind of forward motion. This is what I need to celebrate. I need to celebrate all the youth. I need to celebrate the Lindas who just blew up over the weekend. This little teen girl power punk band. So this is the kinds of things that I just need to echo what John is doing in terms of the big picture, the umbrella issues of policymaking, of legislation, of politics, of persons who we can all get involved in allyship, and amplifying what Bill needs to do, because in terms of saying who we are needs that kind of projectile kind of power with a big P. And we're all in this together, asking for a meeting. Let's make those meetings. Let's say we're having a meeting. You guys come into the table because we have more than 5. We have more. We can invite all of you because we are going to make that room. That's our power.
I love it. Bill, final thought from you.
I want to know what she eats for breakfast because I want it.
Me too.
I want to say one thing that, being a boomer, I think sometimes we probably need to step aside, and Gen Xers and boomers, we kind of clog the pipeline for younger people. And Anita, you said it really well, that we need to find ways to include young people, because they're the ones that are going to help us change what is happening, the racism, the bias, the inequities that we have. And I also want to support what John said earlier, that we need to look at these employee resource groups as an asset for us. The stronger those employee resource groups are in all of our organizations, the better for us, because they are helping us advance change in corporate America and foundations. They are questioning the things that need to be done, and they leaned in on the anti-Asian bias by telling their executives that we must take a stand and do something and put some resources and money and power behind it. So that's how I'd like to end today. And thank you.
Thank you so much. John, one final thought from you before we move to Q&A. So don't go anywhere after your final thought.
Sure. I just love what both Tamlin and Bill said. The only thing I would add to that is change is hard, change is uncomfortable, but that shouldn't stop us from moving towards that change. Sometimes all of us are reluctant to take that risk, but I would ask everyone to just find your own comfort zone in getting outside your comfort zone, because that's where that change will happen.
Yeah, find your strength, be bold, be unapologetically Asian. That is my mantra these days. Thank you so much, Bill and John and Tamlin. You guys are so great. Don't go anywhere. I'm just passing the torch to someone who's far better at me at doing this. And that is Susan Jin Davis. She inspires me every day with her generous leadership and tireless work for the AAPI community. She's also someone I'm honored to call a dear friend. She is a social impact executive. She is laser focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion and human rights. She is currently social impact officer at Al Roker Entertainment and senior advisor on social impact and sustainability for Philadelphia Soccer 2026, and is on call for the Center for Creative Learning. I don't know when you sleep, Susan. Welcome and take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I think we should take this show on the road. This has been a fantastic event, and there's so much to talk to, and we've got a lot of questions. So I'm going to just start right off. John, I know you got to leave. I'm going to start with you. One of the questions that we got from a participant is, how can we educate our elders to stop being racist against other people of color? And again, I guess this would be an AAPI person who'd like to know how best to work within their family and their community on this particular issue.
It's hard. I will admit that it's hard because we're dealing with our elders, we're dealing with ingrained beliefs. Part of it is not being judgmental, at least, and I'll admit part of this is from my own personal experience, is just understanding where they come from. And when I say that, like, again, remembering that about 2/3 of our community are immigrants, as in they came from a different country. Think about how that different country is portraying African Americans, as Latino Americans. I had the privilege of working overseas in China, in Shanghai. And I could tell you, the state media, the way they portray the United States generally and communities of color in the United States, I can understand why Chinese immigrants coming to the United States have certain biases and prejudices. So that's not a reflection of their own personal morals. It's just a reflection of the education that they have that we need to unpack. We need to help them unlearn, not in a judgmental, condescending way, but just recognize that that's the system that oftentimes work against us. And it's a system not just in the United States that has structural racism, but it's systems in other countries as well.
Thanks, John. And in a parting moment, we can look on your website if we want more resources on how to report about hate crimes and about being educated about this particular topic. So I know you got to go, so thank you so much. Speaking of the media, boy, what a great opportunity I have to interview Nidia Han. So one of the questions is that John shared with us a lot of facts that are very unknown to many people. So how do we hold the media accountable to get our stories out there and to get the facts out there so that people are well informed, not misinformed, and are able to be educated and create awareness, and then of course, community?
So I really like the call to engage. So I think if we can get community members, community leaders to write letters into the station to say, these are the kinds of stories I'd like to see, this is the kind of information I need, I think that would be really helpful. I think there is this idea that AAPIs are not a big demographic in terms of watching our news. And so we need to make clear that we're watching, and that we are a customer, and that we are an audience member, and we bring in dollars because we are going to buy whatever that advertising, whatever that product is that they're advertising on TV. And I think that it's also really great if, as I think Bill suggested this, if people would actually demand a meeting with the general manager and with the top guns at all of these media outlets to say, we're here, we matter, and this is the kind of thing that we want to see. I think that is a great way to hold people like my bosses accountable. And then I also think, I was sharing the story earlier that, I was hired by the ABC station in Houston because a group of Asian Americans went to the station and said, we want to see somebody who looks like us. And I think that I would like to see that go even further. So now at my station, so throughout my career until I got here, I was always the only Asian American, not just in the newsroom, but in the entire building. When I first got here, it was me and Frida Wong, who's upstairs in sales. And then now I'm so happy to say that we have Christy Aledo, who is half Filipino, half Black. We have Jacqueline Lee, who is Chinese American. My old co-anchor, who's now on Good Morning America, was Eva Pilgrim, who's half Korean and half Caucasian. So things are changing and moving in the right direction. But I still think in many stations and in many news groups, there's only one of us. And I think that we need to send the message that it's okay if there are more, that one is not enough.
Great answer. Thank you. Tamlin, this one's for you. What is the best way? And we want you to solve Hollywood. So this is why I'm going to ask this question. So good luck. What is the best way for folks to encourage storytellers to include more AAPIs in their cast, to tell more stories about us that reflect our full humanity?
I think it's all around the same kinds of answers that Nydia and Bill have got. You got to amplify, write letters, post something on social media, write email. Those are all in terms of communication, effective ways to let the networks, to let the studios, to let the influencers, to let the tastemakers know who the audience wants to listen to or see. It's super easy. We don't have to be formalistic about it. We just could say, hey, I want to see more Nydia Han stories on ABC 7, ABC in Houston out there. So let's put her on more, have her cover those kinds of protests, that kind of these kinds of stories, because just seeing their face makes us feel, as Asian American Pacific Islanders, that we're out there and doing the work. We're actually in the mix of creating the story, the stories that are told and that are broadcast. And it fights against the misinformation. It fights against the disinformation that's out there. It's like, no, we're not just relating to specifically AAPI stories. We're all relatable to American stories because this is literally who we are. It sounds so simple, but again, it's the power of how we look versus the power of the stories and the usage of our voices that's out there. So in terms of audience members, use your voice, use your fingers, calculate and say that you have 140 letters on Twitter, right? Use those letters and say, I want more Nydia Han, exclamation point. It's very simple. Ask the kids about, or ask the parents how to write letters to networks, how to write letters to ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, whoever. This is the kinds of the interaction that the advertisers look at, because it's about numbers, it's about attention, and it's about access and the scope of their reach. So this is about give and take. So let's give what our opinions and our voices are.
And also not just writing letters too, but also go see the movie made by the Asian American filmmaker featuring Asian American actors. Watch, I just produced and hosted a whole show on 6ABC here in the Philadelphia region about the Asian American community, about Asian American issues. I hope that everyone watched that show, because if my bosses can see that shows like this do well and our ratings are great, we're going to do more of them. But if no one watches that show, then it's going to be a hard sell for me to say, let's do another one, and let's do another one soon.
And don't only ask for it to be broadcast during AANHPI month. Say, this is a pertinent story. Anti-Asian racism is still being out there, is still being told, is still being dealt with. This is the kinds of stories that Nydia has put in the work, and it's out there. Let's get to know these persons, and let's get to know their perspectives. And, celebrating what we are here in this month is great, but let's just not limit ourselves. We demand to be seen throughout the year.
Yeah, and I think as Nydia says, this is America. So how do we allow our voices to be heard as American voices? And I think the other thing that Nydia, you and Tamlin probably would agree with me, it shouldn't just be APIs that write to the networks, that write to the companies. It's about all of us joining forces and saying, we want to hear these American stories. We want to be educated on all Americans.
And I think we do have to really make sure that we're mainstreaming the minorities, so that for us, I make sure that if I do a story, it doesn't just live on a special page dedicated to Asian American issues, that it is on the 6ABC app, that it is on our homepage, so that people will organically just see it and they don't have to go looking for it. I think that's super important. And Tamlin, I could not agree more. I mean, I have been banging the drum on this. We have to make sure that this moment turns into a sustained movement, so that we can change our narrative for good.
So Bill, I got one for you. As an Asian American, how can we be more vocal and open and honest without the fear of retaliation in the workforce or being labeled as difficult? And I'm bringing this to your attention, Bill, because you mentioned the need to have a support group for us. So is that about allyship? Is that about something else? But I think this is going to be an important question to hear an answer on.
Wow, that's a really important question. And part of it is because I've been so concerned about this for the last 20, 30 years, and I know Tamlin has also been very concerned about this, is that we need to make sure that we have a support group in the community that is advocating for you, Susan, advocating for Tamlin and Nydia on a regular basis. And I'm envious of the Black community because they have Black Twitter. When a movie comes out or when something happens in the Black community, that Twitter just lights up and goes on fire. And I want to see that we have that as well. So as we're coalescing as a community, we need to create a groundswell of support to make sure that people, when they get to the highest ranks of corporate America, when they get critical roles for people like Tamlin, when we see people in front of the camera and behind it like Chloe Zoa, that we are speaking up and saying, this is America. This is what we need to have. But we also need the people that are successful in our community to step out. And a lot of Americans don't know this, but when you think about all the things that impact us today, Zoom, started by an Asian American, Pinterest, started by an Asian American, Peloton, started by an Asian American, the movies that are reviewed on Rotten Tomatoes, started by an Asian American, LinkedIn, started by an Asian American. We are part of the fabric of America that helps this country run. So if we can get all of those people to step up and say, I'm here, I'm vested in supporting the community, I believe in diversity and the power that diversity brings to our country, that's going to make a huge difference for us. But in order for people to feel safe, they need to believe that they have somebody standing behind them. And that includes Black Americans, LGBTQ folks, Latinx folks, people with disabilities, veterans, whoever it might be. We need those people to speak up on our behalf as well. And part of it, again, is if we can move away from this vernacular that excludes and come up with a way that includes, that's going to make so much of a difference. But we can't do that without people like you in critical roles within corporate America, foundations, and nonprofits. And we can't do that unless the community agrees. They need to put their ego aside for a moment and put the community's interests first. If we don't do that, we're not going to be able to succeed.
So that actually goes really nicely into the next question. And by the way, for the attendee that asked that question, sponsorship and mentorship is really helpful for career growth, but also to allow you to have a safe space to talk about things that may not be working and to be able to strategize on some solutions around addressing those without the fear of retaliation, because you could have somebody like a mentor or sponsor, be the one that vocalizes these things or be the one that backs you up on some of your concerns. So on that front, I'd love to open it up to all three of you to say, what has been your experience with mentorship and sponsorship? And what's the advice you have for people coming up and how they should be seen and heard? How does mentors and sponsors, how do they help that? And how have they helped you all get to where you are? Nydia, if you want to start.
So I wouldn't be here if it weren't for the Asian American Journalists Association. The mentors and the leaders and the people that I have met through that organization have been instrumental in helping me get every job that I've had. And I've had a lot of them. My first job was in Pocatello, Idaho, and then Oklahoma City, Houston, and now I've been in Philadelphia for almost 20 years. But, I actually met the then assistant news director of this station at the AAJA conference that we had one year. And so I know very well how important it is that we uplift and empower each other, because if people weren't doing that for me, I wouldn't have had the career that I've had. And, I believe very much in paying it forward. And so I now am a mentor for a number of aspiring journalists. And I'm really happy to say that 2 of my mentees are actually working now in the Philadelphia market and on the air here. So, I'm really proud of them and really happy about that. And, I also realized, like Denise Nakano, who used to work for Channel 10, the NBC station here, who's now working for HYY or KYW News Radio. She and I have collaborated on a number of things and continue to do that. And we find that, when we work together, we can actually get more information out there to more people and create change. So it was Denise actually who saw that there was a racist social media meme posted by the, at the time, a board member of SAG-AFTRA of the Philadelphia chapter. And, Denise flagged it to me. We both amplified that on social media. And in the end, that racist meme was taken down. The board member resigned. He's now been replaced by a Chinese American actor who lives in Delaware, Lyman Chen. And SAG-AFTRA put out a much stronger statement after all of that happened. So, I think that it's important, and I know full well how important it is that we work together.
So Tamlin, you're much too young to have a pioneer mantle in Hollywood and in entertainment, but you do, because it's fairly recent that we're seeing more of us on camera, for sure. So for mentors and sponsors, like, who are some of the folks that helped you get to be where you are and to be one of the most prominent AAPIs in Hollywood?
Oh my gosh, Susan, I love you. I love you because you perpetuate that idea that I'm still a young one. But again, for those who don't know, that I was a high school student when AAJA started. So Trisha Toyota and Bill Singh and all those wonderful LA-based journalists back in the day in 1970. I can't remember, 79, 78, 79. They started, and my father knew Trisha Toyota. My father was a LAPD officer, so he was in that mix. So covering with, commingling with Asian American journalists at that time. I was interested in becoming an Asian American journalist, much like Connie Chung, much like Joanne Ishimine, just much like Mario Machado and Ken Kashiwahara. So that was the kind of organization that everybody, no matter what age you are, no matter what stage of your career are, can look to those organizations in the field that you are interested in. So AAJA is obviously up there. For me as an actor, for a writer, for a director, for a producer, CAPE, Coalition of Asian Pacifics in Entertainment, I'm sure that Bill is very familiar with, and he has been there at the start as well. But for every organization, and we know that Asian Americans Advancing Justice also has a mentor internship program. All the organizations that have heads with AAPIs specifically, but also our other ethnic American brother and sister organizations also have mentorships and sponsorships. And it just takes for the person who is interested to just Google and go to that mentorship or sponsorship. But sponsorship also adds a little bit more cachet. It adds a little bit more shine or sparkle to the organization that it's sponsoring. If it's AT&T, if it's your former employer Comcast, if it's NBC Universal, if it's ABC, if it's again HBO or Showtime. These are the kinds of sponsorships that we need to court and say, hey, this is the kind of stories that we want to promote, that we want to tell. You should be a part of it because you don't know the potential and the outreach that it has that affects the viewership across not only our specific AAPI community, but across all the communities across the state. So mentorship and sponsorship, those again, 2 ends of the spectrum, but they serve in terms of bringing people, of collecting people, of funneling people, but also spewing out the light, spewing out the attention, spewing out the need and the joyous celebration and of these stories and the kinds of people that inhabit them.
Thanks a lot. And speaking of sponsorship, another type of sponsorship is a personal sponsorship. And Bill, I'm going to turn to you. People don't know this, but Bill and Mata is our Kevin Bacon. Everybody who's anybody is connected to Bill somewhere, somehow. And you were a sponsor for me early on to introduce me to your network, open yourself up to give me advice. So I want to thank you for that. But who did that for you?
So it helped when I worked for a big corporation to get a sponsor. It's easy to get a mentor, and a lot of people will be a mentor for you, but a sponsor is really vested in your success. And when I worked for a PR firm, it was a Caucasian person I went to. I said, I need you to sponsor me. And that sponsor is really important because that sponsor is not only advocating for you, to you and to your network, they're advocating for you when you're not in the room. And they also tie often their compensation to your success. And so we actually need to have more of those sponsors in corporate America, because this person took the time to make sure that when I wasn't in the room, he advocated for me. For mentors, I think it's a little bit different. There were no mentors. There was one Chinese American woman named Lin Choyueta who could not succeed in corporate America, so she went off on her own. And she was one of the few PR people in the country that I can turn to. And I have to tell you, I was afraid of her. She was in your face, loud, running around telling me, Bill, you could be doing better. You could be doing better. But probably the other mentor I had was a Latino gentleman. And I think one thing that's important for the people in the audience is that you have to find a mentor and negotiate with that person the time that they need to commit to you, the time you can commit to them. And that's a little bit of a process, which I don't think people understand. But I negotiated with this executive from Anheuser-Busch, Latino. And one of the first things he taught me was to ask for things. And I asked him, like a typical stereotype Asian, I'm really, really sorry to bother you. I know how busy you are, but can I have 20 minutes of your time? And he said, absolutely, Bill. Fly to St. Louis, you'll get your 20 minutes. I flew to St. Louis. I got there early, stereotype Asian person. I was there at 7:30, meeting at 8. He lets me at 8 sharp, and we're having this great conversation about how to build my business. At 8:20, he looks at his watch and he says, it's time for you to leave. And I said, I beg your pardon? I flew all the way from LA to St. Louis and you're asking me to leave? The conversation's going great. He goes, Mr. Amata, you asked for 20 minutes of my time. I gave it to you. It's now 8:21, get out. And on the way out, he said, Asian Americans need to ask for what they want. If you want 2 hours, ask for it. And that's something really I learned from you, Susan, is that you are fearless about asking for what you want. And so even though I might have sponsored you, you turned that all around and you sponsor so many other people, like Nydia said and Tamlin said. Once we take the responsibility of sponsoring and that person moves on, that person also has an obligation to pay it forward. And all of you do that, and you've done it 20-fold, 30-fold, 100-fold. And for that, I'm grateful.
Well, thanks, Bill. But, you didn't meet my mother. And if you did, you know why I'm fearless, because there is nobody scarier than her. So now that I faced her, everything's a cakewalk. So I have a question for all of you. And that is, who are your personal Asian American role models? And Nydia, we were all talking before we went live about the fact that there's so little known about famous, well-known, important Asian Americans, AAPIs. And there's more than Jackie Chan. There's actually others. And so I want to have you all share people in your life who've been personal AAPI role models. So Nydia, I'll start with you.
Well, I mean, on a very personal level, I know it's such a go-to, but my parents, I owe everything I am to my parents. I mean, my father left Korea, borrowed money for a plane ticket to get his PhD at Rutgers. And, he paid that plane ticket off in installments. He did not go back to Korea or see his parents or his family for more than 10 years because he couldn't afford it once he came to this country. And when I think about that kind of sacrifice, I have so much gratitude, and I'm so inspired by his journey as well as my mom. So my mom left Korea when she was in her late 20s, at a time when everyone thought she should already be married. But she really wanted to study in Europe. And so she went to France, and she spent time in Paris and Nice and got her graduate degree to be a teacher. And she's just a real ball buster. She kind of just did what she wanted. And she was also just like this fearless character. And I just learned so much from her. And she always taught me to really find my passion and figure out what I want to do for the world, and then figure out a way to make money doing it. And so I really appreciate that both of them really instilled in me this idea that I should just go for my dreams. And then the other thing that I'm so grateful that they did is they always instilled in me this idea that to be American, I have to understand, embrace, and acknowledge the gifts of our ancestors. So it was very important to them that I learned and spoke Korean, that I, engaged in all of our traditions. So like every New Year's Day, we would do sebae, which is big bow to our elders to wish them a healthy, happy, year ahead. They would teach me how to make mandu, which is Korean dumplings. And now my father is teaching that same thing to our kids. And I think I've always had kind of a deeply rooted confidence in being Asian American, because my parents always taught me that, it is something to be proud of. On a less personal level, one of my greatest mentors, and someone who I just think is, excuse me, but badass, is Mia Yamamoto, who was born in an internment camp in Boston, Arizona. She later became a civil rights activist and lawyer. And she is just such a tremendous champion for human rights in general and for civil rights in general, but a great voice for our community. And she also is such a great voice for the LGBTQ community. She was actually born under a different name. She was born a man, and she transitioned when she was in her 60s to become Mia. And so I think about her quite often, actually, and especially when I'm sort of down and feeling like I'm battling things. I think about all of the fights that she fought and won. So she's just a great inspiration to me.
That's great. Now, Tamlin, how about you?
Oh my goodness. I just love hearing the personal stories of people whom I have the pleasure of learning from. And, hearing your story, Lydia, it's just like, yeah, we're so much alike. And it's resounding. It echoes. I know it within, not only our particular generation, but generations before and generations after. It's like to pass along our legacies, who we come from, where we come from, and why. Again, it's like, why did we come? Why did you guys come here? And what were those sacrifices? What was the price exacted? What were the costs that you had to pay? This is the meaning of knowing and owning our histories. Again, it's stereotypical. It is my parents. My father is an American-born Japanese American Nisei, second generation, and he and his family went through the Japanese American internment camp incarceration experience of Manzanar. So I have that story, but I also have my mother's story. When my father was a U.S. Army soldier, he was based in Okinawa, Japan. My mother, being half Okinawa and half Filipina, was a skilled enough singer that the USO asked her to entertain the troops in the officers club. So she and her sister would sing, and that's how they learned English, was singing American standards in the 50s and the 60s. My father, handsome Japanese American soldier, saw this, beautiful Okinawan Filipina lady, fell in love with her, married her, had me, and they came back to LA to start their families. So I come from two distinct lines of what it means to be Asian American and Asian in America, and to honor those two threads of persons who have had generations of families living here, but also the newer immigrants. Even now, the new immigrants of whatever particular cultural or ethnic background they come from, is that I don't know the language. I don't know how the system works. I need to provide food for my family. I need to go to the grocery store. Knowing what grocery stores are all over the world is totally different from what it is when you go to your local grocery store here. So it's the kinds of little lessons. It's the distillation of the basic needs. It's like, do we sleep in a bed? My mother slept on the floor. It's like sleeping with sheets and pillows and blankets. It's like, oh my gosh, just trying to imagine and use those kinds of tools. I think we each individuals have in seeking our parent stories, our grandparent stories, and so on. So that automatically, I think for most of us, makes our parents and our grandparents heroes, because they came from somewhere else as literal aliens to come here to be Americans. And that's what it is to be American. They had the forethought, they had the choice. For me, Mia Yamamoto, oh my God, Nydia Han, you just took it away. But, celebrating our next month in June, LGBTQ Pride Month, she is one of those, she straddles Asian American Pacific Islander Month with Pride Month. But I think I just want to, again, draw attention to another organization, hashtag See Us Unite, which has been putting out videos, which are putting out 14 videos in conjunction with May 19th, the birthday of Yuri Kochiyama and Malcolm X, that kind of solidarity, a Black and Asian solidarity. And they've been putting out videos concentrating on Yuri Kochiyama, on Grace Lee Boggs. Yesterday was Larry Leong and Philip Vera Cruz and Dolores Huerta. I believe yesterday was Etta James and Sugar Pie DeSantos. These are the kinds of stories that I love to see, because I go, we can all celebrate them. So I encourage you all to go on Insta, See Us Unite, May 19th project. We're going to learn a lot.
Thank you, Tamlin. And I love the fact that Nydia, you and Tamlin talked about American stories.
Yeah.
Those are your stories, American stories. So Bill, bring us home with your heroes, your Asian American role models.
So I would definitely say my parents, but I'm going to use Lynn Choyueta. Lynn Choyueta is in her 80s. She started a public relations agency way before anybody even started a public relations agency, because she couldn't fit in corporate America, and corporate America didn't support her. And she taught me 3 things, and I'll just pass those on. And one of them is people support what they help create, was one thing that she said. Another thing that she said that I still remember today is that there's times to compete and there's times to collaborate. And I was competing with her as this upstart agency, and she pulled me in and said, I want to be one of your mentors. Let me tell you what it's really like. Let me tell you what it was like being an Asian American and doing this, and even worse, being an Asian female and trying to succeed in this. And well before the men said this, one of the other things that she said was, if you want to predict the future, create it. And that is the reason why I helped start all these national groups, is because she started the Asian Business Association of Los Angeles, and she started the Asian American Engineers and Scientists organization, because she wanted to make sure that if nobody else was creating these things, that she would do it. And she's now in her 80s. She checks in every so often. She helped me get my start, even though I was her competitor. So she's my role model.
That's terrific. So in the waning minutes we have, we've got so much learnings from this. So thank you all. But I wrote a couple down that really were memorable. Tamlin, have curiosity about all American stories. Bill, don't believe the hype around things like the model minority myth, which make us invisible. Challenge those myths. Nydia, show up for other communities, because we are all one community and we need to be there for each other. And John, if we're going to build a house of unity, we need to build it brick by brick. This has been an amazing journey with all of you. Thank you so much. Thank you to WICT and NAMIC New York and for AIM. And I'll turn it over to either Lisa, Radia, Mika, or Gloria to close us out. But thank you all for being here, and thank you to the audience for your participation. So I'll turn it over. Or maybe I won't. Well, it sounds like I'm not turning it over. So with that, please listen to the recording, because I know I didn't really write enough notes. I need to go back and listen and learn, and continue to open your hearts and minds to all the stories that we need to learn and know about, and be allies and be there for each other. So thanks so much, and have a great day.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye, everyone. Take care.
Take care.